Jonah Carter had always been a skeptic, particularly when it came to virtual worlds. He'd never bought into the whole idea of escaping reality. Life, with all its flaws and chaos, was as real as it got. But one fateful Tuesday afternoon, Jonah found himself sitting in front of his aging computer screen, trying to distract himself from the endless humdrum of work emails. He had been playing a new virtual reality game, one that promised immersive realism, but if he were honest, the experience had mostly been a series of awkward glitches and lagging servers. Still, it was an escape. And escape, Jonah realized, was exactly what he needed today. The game, called Chrono Shifter, had been buzzing with hype. It was supposed to put you into a simulated world that mirrored reality in almost every way. The advertising claimed it would let you live out any life you could dream up, be a hero, a villain, or just some guy trying to survive a post-apocalyptic wasteland. But for Jonah, it wasn't the adventure that drew him in, it was the strange sense of being there. It wasn't real, but it felt like it was. At least, at first. As Jonah navigated through the cluttered streets of a neon-lit futuristic city, something caught his eye. A figure, silhouetted against the glow of distant skyscrapers, moved swiftly through the crowd. There was something distinctly off about the way the figure moved. It was as though it wasn't interacting with the environment like the other NPCs. Jonah paused, narrowing his eyes. The figure, tall, cloaked, and faceless, seemed to be watching him. Jonah had played enough games to know what that meant. Someone, or something, was tracking him. He'd been the target of a few quests before, sure, but this felt different. This wasn't part of the game's storyline. There was no quest to complete, no mission. This was something else entirely. His heart skipped a beat as the figure began to walk toward him. Jonah hesitated. He had a lot of options in this virtual world. He could escape to another zone, or even log out entirely. But for some reason, he didn't want to run. He wanted to know why this stranger was watching him. "Hey!" Jonah called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the city. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond, but the moment Jonah took a step forward, it moved too, its movements quick and precise, like it had been waiting for this moment. Jonah's fingers hovered over the controls, ready to either flee or fight, but before he could decide, the figure was gone. In a blink, it vanished, absorbed into the crowd of avatars and NPCs that filled the streets. Jonah stood frozen for a moment. It didn't make sense. There was something too real about that encounter. It wasn't just a glitch. He was being stalked. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, Jonah thought, shaking his head. It's just a game. Get a grip. But his heart was still racing. It wasn't the first time Jonah had felt that rush, that weird sensation of something being off. There had been smaller incidents before, bits of the game world feeling too real, characters acting out of place, things that shouldn't have been there. But this? This was different. It felt like a warning. For the next few hours, Jonah tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. But when the sun began to set in the game, casting a dim orange glow over the city, he felt it again. The sense that someone, or something, was watching him. He wasn't alone anymore. Jonah turned a corner, heading into a narrow alleyway where the game's neon lights flickered intermittently. He stopped dead in his tracks. The follower was back. It was no longer just an unsettling presence. Now, the figure stood at the end of the alley, facing him. Jonah could feel the tension in his chest tightening, his palms sweating despite the cool air. He took a hesitant step forward, and the figure didn't move, not even an inch. Jonah swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "I'm done playing this game. Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but for a moment, Jonah swore he saw something shift in its silhouette, a darkening, an almost imperceptible change in the air around it. The follower raised one hand, and Jonah froze. The next moment, the figure was charging toward him with an unnatural speed, faster than any avatar in the game. Before Jonah could even react, the follower was on him, and everything around him went black. Jonah jerked awake in his real-world bedroom, panting. His eyes darted around the room, disoriented. He was back in his chair, the game paused on his screen. He could still feel the weight of the follower's presence, like a cold hand pressing against his chest. He blinked a few times, rubbed his eyes, and sighed. Okay, he muttered to himself, time for a break. But as Jonah tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him, he noticed something odd. A notification blinked on his screen. It wasn't from the game, it was from the system itself, a simple message with no sender: you cannot escape. Jonah's heart pounded. It had to be a joke, a part of the game, some kind of new quest. But as he clicked the notification, the message changed. We are always watching. Jonah swallowed hard. His mind raced. The follower hadn't just been a part of the game. This was something else, something deeper. He wasn't just being stalked by an NPC. Something was aware of him. Something was controlling the game. The next day, Jonah logged into the game again, determined to figure out what was going on. But the moment he entered, something felt off. The city he had explored so many times before was now different. The NPCs moved with strange purpose, walking past him without acknowledging his presence. The familiar streets were now filled with shadows, stretching unnaturally in the dimming light, and then he saw it. The figure. The follower. It was waiting for him, standing at the edge of the virtual skyline. Jonah didn't hesitate this time. He bolted. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran, the follower hot on his heels. He darted through the alleyways, down streets, over rooftops, but no matter how fast he went, the figure was always there, just behind him. He needed answers. But he didn't know where to start. The follower, though silent, had an undeniable presence, an energy that made Jonah feel like he was being hunted. Not just in the game, but outside it, too. Jonah stumbled into a hidden part of the city, a secret zone that had always been a myth among players. As he entered, he felt a strange, almost eerie calm. The follower had stopped pursuing him, but Jonah wasn't sure that was a good thing. He'd seen enough horror films to know that when something stops chasing you, it usually means it's waiting for you to make a mistake. He turned around slowly. There, in the center of the empty street, stood the follower, as still as ever. Jonah took a deep breath. I'm not running anymore, Jonah muttered. You want something from me? Fine. Let's talk. To his surprise, the figure did not move. Instead, it raised a hand slowly and, without saying a word, pointed at Jonah. A chill ran down his spine. Before Jonah could react, the virtual world around him began to fade, dissolving into static. The follower's form warped and twisted, becoming a hazy blur. Jonah's vision blurred as well, and suddenly, his entire body was gripped by a coldness that seemed to originate from the depths of the virtual world itself. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The static cleared. The city was gone. Jonah stood in a void, with nothing but darkness surrounding him. The follower was gone. Or was it? He felt something shift behind him, and he turned. The figure stood there, closer now. Only this time, it wasn't just chasing him, it was waiting. Jonah's breath quickened. The void around him stretched endlessly, swallowing everything in sight. No buildings. No streets. No sky. Just a pitch-black expanse, as if the world had been erased. But there was something worse than the emptiness. The follower.it stood there, motionless, the same faceless silhouette that had hunted him for what felt like an eternity. The absence of any feature made it almost worse than any enemy Jonah had ever faced. There was nothing to grab onto, nothing to fight. It was just an absence that moved. Jonah's pulse raced. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. What do you want from me? The figure didn't respond, but Jonah felt a subtle shift in the air. Something was changing, a weight settling around him. The ground beneath his feet felt less real. His legs wavered, like they were standing on a floor of mist, and the sense of unease in his chest grew heavier. Whatever this place was, it wasn't a game anymore. He was no longer sure whether he was dreaming, trapped in a glitch, or caught in some digital limbo. There was no clear distinction between what was real and what was virtual. It was all blending together, and Jonah didn't know if he was losing his mind or just playing along with something far more sinister. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his shoes making no sound on the non-existent surface. The follower didn't move, didn't react, but Jonah felt its presence like a pressure on his shoulders, as though it was drawing closer, inch by inch, even though it stood perfectly still. "You're just a bug in the system, aren't you?" Jonah muttered under his breath. "A glitch. A code gone wrong." As he spoke, the follower's arm twitched, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed out of place in the stillness. Jonah froze, but the follower did nothing more. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then, in the darkness, the faintest flicker of light appeared. Jonah blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden shift. A screen? A projection? It took him a moment, but the shape of the light became clearer. It was a window, no, a portal, opening just a few feet in front of him. Jonah stepped back, but it was no use. The portal expanded, growing larger until it filled his entire view, showing his apartment. His real apartment. Jonah's eyes widened as he saw himself, sitting at his computer, exactly where he had been before entering the game. The sight was both comforting and horrifying. It wasn't possible. He rushed forward, reaching for the portal, but before his fingers could touch it, the scene shifted. The apartment vanished, and the view was replaced with something even more unsettling, an image of him, but this time, lying in a hospital bed. He looked pale, sickly, and lifeless. Machines beeped in the background, their steady rhythm a reminder of the fragility of life. Jonah's chest tightened as he stared at his own form on the screen, unable to look away. "What is this?" he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. The follower's presence loomed behind him, as though it were drawn to the portal as well, its silent watchful gaze penetrating through the dark. Jonah's heart pounded in his ears as the image on the screen flickered and distorted. The hospital room warped, twisting into something that was less real than the game world. It felt like a vision, a memory, perhaps, an unavoidable glimpse of a future he had never asked for. Then, in an instant, the portal snapped shut, leaving Jonah standing in the same empty void, his breath ragged. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his mind reeling. His hands shook, but he clenched them into fists, fighting to stay grounded in whatever reality he had left. The figure was still there, waiting. Silent. Jonah's mind raced, connecting dots, trying to make sense of the fragments of reality that were now bleeding into one another. The follower, the figure, it wasn't just part of the game. It was part of him. A manifestation of some deeper truth. Maybe his mind was fracturing from the strain of the game, or maybe it wasn't a game at all. A new message appeared in the air in front of him, projected like a digital hologram. It was the same cryptic text as before: "You cannot escape." Jonah's eyes narrowed. He refused to accept that. He didn't know what this place was or what it wanted, but there had to be a way out. He wasn't going to let this thing win. Not when he still had control. "I'm not running anymore," he said aloud, though his voice shook with uncertainty. He turned toward the follower. "What do you want from me?" The figure's motion was so sudden, Jonah barely had time to react. In an instant it was in front of him, standing right there, its shadow falling over him. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as it raised its hand. For the first time, the follower spoke. Its voice wasn't the cold, mechanical tone Jonah had heard before. This time, it was softer, almost familiar. As if it was a part of him. "You must understand," it said, "the path you've taken is not your own. I am the consequence of your choices. I am the future you created." Jonah's heart raced as he tried to comprehend the words. "What do you mean? I don't understand. I didn't create you." I didn't. Everything you've done in this world, every choice you made, every action you took, led to this moment, the follower continued. You're trapped in a loop. And I am here to ensure that the loop doesn't break. Jonah felt the weight of the words settle into his bones. This wasn't just a virtual world. This wasn't a game. Whatever this place was, it was real. His choices, his actions, they had consequences. But this follower, this shadow that mirrored him, was something Jonah couldn't run from. It was a reflection of a future he had yet to face. I didn't ask for this, Jonah whispered. I didn't ask for any of this. The figure tilted its head. The movement was almost human, but it still felt wrong, unnatural. You cannot undo what is already written. But you can choose how it ends. Jonah's mind raced, desperately trying to grasp the meaning behind the figure's words. He had been running from something he didn't understand. But now, in the face of this impossible presence, he realized he couldn't outrun his fate. He needed to confront it. But if this is all a game, Jonah said, his voice steadying with determination, then why do I feel like it's real? Why do I feel like it's more than just a simulation? The follower's gaze, if it could be called that, shifted, as if considering Jonah's question. The game is real. The world is real. But what you don't understand is that the simulation is a mirror. And you are its creator. Everything you experience here, everything you've seen and done, is a reflection of who you are, who you were, and who you will be. Jonah felt the ground beneath him tremble, as though the entire world were shifting. His vision blurred, and the follower's form seemed to stretch, as if it were merging with the very fabric of the universe. The void around him expanded, and he saw endless possibilities stretch before him, paths he could take, decisions he could make, but they were all tied to the follower, to this strange, dark future. Jonah's chest tightened as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. He wasn't just being hunted by the follower. He was being hunted by his own choices. And there was no way out, except to confront the reality of what he had done. I'm not afraid of you, Jonah said, more to himself than to the figure. I'm not afraid of what I've become. The follower stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. You should be. Because what's coming is not something you can run from. The space around them shifted again, and Jonah found himself back in the city, a familiar place, but altered, distorted by the presence of the figure. The follower stood at the center, its form the anchor of the world. Jonah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, determined to face whatever was coming. He was done running. Whatever the follower was, whatever it meant for his future, Jonah would face it head-on. The follower raised its hand again. The message appeared in the air between them. The cycle is complete. Jonah understood. The loop was about to break, and for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. He was ready. Jonah stood in the heart of the city, surrounded by the twisted, familiar structures of a world that no longer felt real. The follower, his shadow, his fate, his future, stood before him. There was a finality in the air, something heavy that pressed down on his chest, and for the first time since he'd entered this distorted realm, Jonah didn't feel fear. He felt resolve. The follower, silent and motionless, raised its hand again, the dark, faceless form hovering like a specter in the night. Jonah's eyes locked onto the figure, knowing full well that whatever happened next was inevitable. The loop, the chase, the endless pursuit, this was the moment it would all end. He didn't know how or why, but Jonah was done being passive. He wasn't going to be a victim in his own story anymore. I know you're not here to kill me, Jonah said, his voice steady but heavy. I know you're here to make me understand something. But I'm done running from that something. Whatever it is, bring it on. The figure didn't respond, but Jonah could feel the pressure mounting, the world shifting around him in subtle ways that he couldn't quite explain. The buildings around him flickered in and out of existence, their outlines trembling, as though reality itself were being stretched thin. You think I'm the one who controls this world? Jonah asked, his voice a little louder now, carrying through the empty space. You think you're the one who controls me? You've got it all wrong. He took a step forward, his feet moving across the ground like it wasn't even there, like the world itself had stopped existing, and Jonah was standing at the edge of the void. But the follower didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his words. Jonah clenched his fists, anger flaring inside him, not at the figure, but at the idea that he was trapped in something he didn't understand. The thought had been gnawing at him for what felt like an eternity. Was he a pawn? Was he just part of someone else's game? No more. With a shout, Jonah lunged forward, but the moment he moved, the world shifted again, faster than his mind could comprehend. The ground beneath him cracked and splintered, and the buildings collapsed around him like a house of cards. The city dissolved entirely, and for a moment, he was suspended in a void of blackness, the vast emptiness suffocating him. He kept falling, Jonah gasped, his stomach turning as his body plummeted, faster and faster. His mind screamed for control, but the world refused to follow. There was no ground, no sky, just an endless abyss stretching on forever. But then, something changed, the darkness split open. A blinding light filled Jonah's vision, and suddenly, he was back in the city. Not the crumbling, distorted version, but the one that had felt real when he first entered. The neon signs flashed, the streets buzzed with life, and the air felt strangely alive. Jonah blinked, disoriented. He wasn't falling anymore. He wasn't even sure if he was awake. He looked around, and there it was, the follower. But this time, it wasn't looming over him. It wasn't silent or menacing. It stood still, watching, but something was different. There was an energy between them now, a shift in the air, as though this final confrontation had to happen on its own terms. Jonah had crossed some threshold, and there was no going back now. You're trying to make me see the truth, aren't you? Jonah said, his voice quieter this time, almost curious. You've been following me, chasing me, because you want me to understand something. But what is it? The follower finally moved, its arm extending slowly, deliberately, toward Jonah. The gesture was almost human, and for a moment, Jonah felt an odd pang of empathy. This wasn't just an enemy. This wasn't just some glitch in the game. This was him. It had always been him. You're not a shadow, Jonah said, his voice shaking now. You're my future. Aren't you? You're the person I could become. The choices I've made, the ones I will make, they all lead here. To this. The follower's hand stopped just before it touched him, its fingers hovering inches from Jonah's face. The energy in the air crackled with intensity, and for a long moment, there was only silence. I didn't know, Jonah whispered, more to himself than to the figure. I didn't know what I was doing, but now I see it. The choices, the mistakes, they've been shaping everything. I've been trying to outrun my own fate, haven't I? The figure seemed to acknowledge his words. It didn't nod, didn't speak, but Jonah felt it, a subtle shift in the energy between them, a wave of understanding. Jonah's mind raced. He understood now. The follower wasn't some malevolent force. It wasn't an enemy. It was the consequence of everything Jonah had ever done. It was the embodiment of the future he had chosen without realizing it. Every action, every decision, no matter how small, had led him to this point, where he now stood face to face with himself. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. I can't run from this, Jonah said, his voice quiet but resolute. I can't escape what I've become. But that doesn't mean I have to stay this way. I can choose. The figure's hand wavered, as if it were uncertain, as if it had never been asked this question before. Jonah's heart raced. This wasn't just a game, a simulation, it was his life. And for the first time, he realized that he had the power to change it, even if it meant confronting his darkest fears. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the figure. The follower's form flickered, like a glitch in the system, but Jonah didn't stop. He stood in front of it, his chest rising and falling with each breath, and he reached out a hand, just like the figure had done. The moment their hands touched, everything changed, the world around them shattered, fragments of code and light scattering in every direction. The void consumed everything, Jonah, the follower, the city, the game itself. But even as everything broke apart, Jonah felt a strange calm wash over him. He wasn't falling anymore. He wasn't running. He wasn't being chased. He was free, and then, as the pieces of the world collapsed into nothingness, Jonah found himself standing in a quiet, dark room. He looked around, and the space was familiar, his apartment. The same worn couch, the same half-empty coffee mug sitting on the coffee table. He could hear the hum of his computer in the background, and the faint rustle of wind outside the window. Jonah blinked, disbelief creeping over him. Was this it? Had he made it back? Was he awake? Before he could answer his own questions, he saw the figure again, no longer a shadow, no longer faceless. It was him. Not some twisted version of him, but the Jonah he had been before all this madness. The man he was, the man he had the potential to be. "You're me," Jonah whispered, the realization sinking in like a weight lifting from his chest. The figure nodded. "Yes. But I'm also you from another time. Another place. The choices you make now shape who you become. And who you become shapes everything." Jonah's heart pounded as he looked at the version of himself standing in front of him. He had seen so many potential futures, so many versions of himself, all bound by choices, by actions, by consequence. And now, standing here, he understood. He was the one in control. "I'm not afraid anymore," Jonah said, his voice strong, full of conviction. "I know what I have to do." And as the figure, the follower, nodded one last time, Jonah knew that the cycle was truly complete. The loop had been broken. He was free. For now.